There is a ticking time bomb with an ever-shortening fuse planted just beneath the country of Russia. For decades, it's been allowed to tick away, uninhibited, with no sign of resolution in sight. The consequences when it finally goes off will be catastrophic for Moscow. You see, Russia has a population problem. Poor Soviet-era policy and mismanagement since its collapse has led to a situation where the average Russian couple are not replacing themselves by having children. Adults are dying early, migration only acts as a partial solution, and hundreds of thousands of Russian men have become casualties in Ukraine. We're going to delve into the facts here and see if Russia's past and present is costing the Kremlin its future. Russia is running out of Russians. So, what are the facts on the ground here? What kind of demographic crisis is Russia really facing? Well, Russia's population today stands at around 144 million people, and it's been that way since the 1990s. Russia for decades, alongside the USSR before it, used various strategies and tricks to stave off population decline and keep the number of people in Russia at a stable level. But as we've entered the 21st century, several factors that have been working against Russia have started to get worse, paving the way for a potential rapid decline in population in the near future. The yearly growth rate of the Russian population fell in the 90s and simply never recovered, and now those demographic issues are coming home to roost for the Kremlin. Today we're going to go into detail about how Russia's birth rate, its death rate, its level of migration, and the war in Ukraine are all contributing to future Russian population decline. In highly populated oblasts like Leningrad and Sevastopol, Russian women, on average, give birth to less than one child in their lifetimes. Reuters reports that the Kremlin described the crisis as, quote, a disaster for the country in 2024. Russian President Vladimir Putin has seemingly understood the scope of the issue for quite some time. In his inaugural 2000 address to the nation, Putin warned that Russia could become an enfeebled nation due to its population decline. In the 2010 census, it was recorded that 20,000 villages in Russia were completely abandoned, with another 36,000 housing fewer than 10 people, according to Al Jazeera. In 2022, the situation became so bad that President Putin reintroduced a Soviet-era medal to be given to mothers alongside a cash sum for those who gave birth to 10 children. It's fair to say that the Kremlin is clutching at straws. But what are the reasons for this decline? Just how did this situation get so feeble? The first, and one of the most important factors to look at in controlling a population's relative growth, is the birth rate. Russia has been suffering with a persistent difficulty in achieving higher birth rates ever since the Soviet era. The number of births in any country is known as the total fertility rate, or TFR for short. In order to maintain a population without increased migration, the TFR for a country needs to be around 2.1, according to the Atlantic Council, or AC, although Russia's higher than average adult mortality rate means that it may even need to be higher. Russia has not approached a TFR of 2.1 since around 1988, and this in large part contributes to Russia's consistent population decline. One reason for this is the legacy of Soviet policy. Russia in the Soviet era had less access to effective birth control, and there was a resistance among Russian men to adopt the use of condoms. But Simon, I hear you cry, surely that led to more pregnancies, and well, you'd be right. But many of these pregnancies were unwanted, and with no other solutions, abortion was widely utilized. American economist Murray Feshbach was able to calculate that the Soviet-era abortion rate averaged 7 abortions per woman. Economics is also linked closely to birth rates. When a country is doing well and times are good, people have more kids because they are in a position to financially look after and raise them. When times are tough, misery consumes and there are already enough mouths to feed, which prevents prospective pregnant people from planning potential parenthood. Even in the Soviet era, many struggled to get by, which meant that the birth rate among certain sections of Russia has struggled for decades, and when pregnancy did occur, economic circumstances may have pushed women towards options like abortion instead. This economic issue, of course, did not get any better after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990. The breakdown of the Warsaw Pact and the wider USSR disrupted decades-long economic linkages, supply chains, and cooperation agreements. Such economic insecurity only worsened the problem across the whole post-Soviet space, but especially in Russia. In the 1990s, the RAND Corporation reported the result of all these disruptions was the decline of the Russian birth rate to among the lowest on Earth, and abortion rates rising to among the highest. At the turn of the millennium, when Vladimir Putin came to prominence, the Russian TFR was 1.25, almost half of what the country would need to sustain its population. Ironically, the motherland wasn't a big fan of motherhood. Russia's TFR has continued to slump and drag. In 2006, Putin's rhetoric around the demographic crisis facing Russia turned into actual policies for the first time. At the time, the president, still in his first term, launched a national agenda to try and bring the birth rate back up again. The Kremlin prioritized and emphasized a program known as maternity capital. This offered incentives to women for the birth or adoption of another child, usually in the form of financial compensation. The fund would be paid to a family when the state-incentivized child turned 3 years old. The funds could be used for housing, the child's education, the mother's pension, and even assistance for children with disabilities. It might be the most progressive policy Putin ever produced. This has since been amended over time to include payments for a first child, as well as improving housing. This did encourage additional births among rural populations, but in urban populations, where the cost was higher and 70% of the population lived, it failed to make a dramatic impact. Russia's TFR did increase a little, though, and by 2007 it was 1.39. It even reached a peak of a staggering 1.8 in 2015, but this was owing to a larger number of Russian women reaching childbearing age and an economic boost in the form of high oil prices. But again, it didn't last. By 2021, the TFR was back to 1.49. In 2022, the Center for Eastern Studies claimed the Russian birth rate was at 9 per 1,000 residents, making it one of the lowest in the world. The Atlantic Council reported that by 2023, births reflected the lowest fertility rate in the past 2 or 3 centuries in Russia. The ongoing war in Ukraine, financial difficulties in Russia itself, and the increased misery that is born from that has ensured the birth rate is still declining. According to an October 2023 survey by Russian Field, Russians are pessimistic about the future. 43% expected their financial situation to worsen within the next year or two, while only 21% anticipated an improvement. Would you want to bring a child into the world with all of that uncertainty and economic difficulty? It's a choice a lot of Russians have declined. But there may be more consequence to Russia's population decline, and that's not how often Russians are born, but how often they die. It's not just the birth rate of a nation that is important in assessing its population projections. Arguably, more important is the death rate. As the higher the rate, the faster the population will decline, and the more measures need to be introduced to stop it, as well as the more births are needed to successfully offset it. But this isn't easy. Russia has been unable to solve endemic issues in the nation's public health system that have been contributing to a higher death rate for decades now. Throughout the life cycle of the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation, unhealthy diets and lifestyles, binge alcohol consumption and accidents have all contributed to higher than average mortality numbers. By the 1960s, Russia's high infant mortality and low adult life expectancy were outliers compared with most highly industrialized countries. Russia's toxic relationship with alcohol has long affected its population adversely. Former USSR Premier Mikhail Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign in the late 80s generated a brief reprieve where life expectancy increased, but it didn't have a long-lasting legacy. And in the late 1990s, the RAND Corporation reported that Russia was still experiencing unusually high death rates from non-natural causes, many of which were related in some way to alcoholism. When President Putin was first elected at the turn of the millennium, Russian men aged 18 to 64 were dying at 4 times the rate of European men, according to the Atlantic Council. Meanwhile, Russian women were dying at about the same rate as European men. Statista shows that the Russian life expectancy for men has never even gone above 68, whilst Russian women's rate has never risen above 80. Both are below their counterparts in other industrialized parts of the world. The AC also states that Russia's TFR dropped back to 1.5 by 2019 as Russia's COVID response resulted in the highest per capita death rate among industrialized nations. Even in 2022, and not taking into account the Ukraine conflict, Russian men die at twice the rate of European men. Russian men die, on average, 6 years sooner than in Bangladesh, another nation which has faced immense financial hardship. So, the birth rate has plummeted, and Russia's death rates are some of the highest of their near peers in the entire world. So, how do you remedy a situation like that? Is Russia's population doomed to slowly wither away to nothing? Well, not exactly. Moscow does have a few tricks up its sleeve to slow the decline. One of those tricks? Migration. Another key factor that influences a population's growth and decline is its net migration, which just means the number of people coming into the country to live and work minus the number that leave. Russian economic issues that began with Gorbachev's perestroika continued into the 1990s, which alongside higher mortality and fewer births led to significant emigration out of Russia. The collapse of the Soviet Union spurred a massive population relocation, where those with different ethnicities to Russia left for their newly created homelands, especially in Central Asia. This reorganization also led to an immigration crisis in Russia proper, as Russians who were in other parts of the Soviet Union returned to the motherland. Data from the Russian State Statistics Service, Goskonstat, indicate legal immigration peaked at 1.147 million people in 1994 and declined each year thereafter, shrinking to 350,900 in 2000 and just 70,000 in 2004. These declining numbers and the ongoing demographic issues weren't exactly a secret, as we saw from RAND's 1997 report. This makes the Russian government's choice to adopt a highly restrictive legal migration law in 2002 all the more baffling. This law came even despite Putin's comments on the demographic crisis just 2 years before. The remigration did largely offset the population loss in the 90s, despite huge hits to public health and the economy, otherwise dragging it down, but it could not last. There were only so many Russians living in former Soviet republics that chose to come home. By 2005, though, it was clear this wasn't working, as the number of those returning to Russia was diminishing each year on average. This may have later prompted Putin's various policy attempts to bring the birth rate back up. It's not simply a question of ensuring enough people come into the country, however, but also the number of people who've left. Even before the war in Ukraine began, Russia had been experiencing a significant brain drain, a phenomenon where educated people in a population leave a country en masse to seek a brighter future elsewhere. Educated Russians were choosing to leave in favor of work in places like the US, Europe, and even China. 3 places that prospectively offer higher salaries and better quality of life for the educated. The Atlantic Council reports that just before the war, Valery Falkov, Russia's Minister of Science and Higher Education, told Putin that the number of scientists in Russia was declining. Nikolai Dolgushkin, the Russian Academy of Sciences chief scientific secretary, reported that emigration by scientists had increased from 14,000 in 2012 to 70,000 in 2021. Russia was the only developed nation where the number of scientific personnel was shrinking rather than growing. This is a far cry from the thousands of dedicated and intelligent Soviet scientists committing their work and lives to the USSR in years gone by. Russia has had to increasingly turn to migration in order to keep the economy going as the Russian population continues to falter. In the late 2010s and early 2020s, there was a dramatic increase in the number of Russian passports issued to foreigners, from around 269,000 in 2018 to a record 735,000 in 2021. This suggests that the Kremlin currently treats naturalization as a method to fill demographic gaps. However, this too has failed to address the core issue of population decline. It will not make people live longer or have more children by itself. The Center for Eastern Studies stated that since 2020, positive net migration no longer compensates for the natural population decline in Russia. It is no longer enough to simply bring more people in. This will have long-standing consequences for Russia's demography as a whole, as the more non-ethnic Russians brought in to bridge the employment gap, the less dominant the Russian diaspora becomes over time. This is a lose-lose situation for the Kremlin, and in 2022, a certain conflict made the issue of migration a whole lot worse. Of course, we're yet to talk about the 3-day special military operation-sized elephant in the room, and that, of course, is the ongoing war in Ukraine. As you might imagine, the number of Russian soldiers, conscripted or otherwise, who have been killed in the fighting is growing daily. This is naturally exacerbating the demographic crisis that Russia is facing at home. The USA puts the total number of killed and wounded Russians at around 315,000. The UK's Ministry of Defence puts the number at 450,000, and the Atlantic Council goes as high as 500,000, as corroborated by French intelligence. If you want to know more about how these figures are calculated, take a look at our Counting the Dead videos on this channel. Heavy casualties in Ukraine means a smaller population of Russians will have to fill those gaps in the economy by taking up jobs vacated by now deceased or wounded soldiers. Russia's unemployment rate is already very low due to the war and existing crisis, and the economy may be forced to shrink in order to accommodate having fewer workers. The consequences of the war isn't solely placed on the soldiers, however, when it comes to demographic problems. Women in Russia are choosing to forego having children, and women themselves are also being sent to fight in Ukraine in small numbers, mostly from prison populations. What's more, hundreds of thousands of young and educated Russian citizens have left the country in order to avoid being conscripted by Moscow, further contributing to a severe demographic decline. It's hard to know just how many potential soldiers have left Russia in the mobilization panic. The Atlantic Council reports that as many as 700,000 Russians are currently living in Dubai. If that is any indicator of the wider trend, well over 1 million Russians may be currently living outside of their nation. In 2023, the Atlantic Council stated that the number of people trying to return to Russia was the lowest in a decade, with mobilization being a likely deterrent. The The Kremlin appears to have tried several strategies in order to enlist as many soldiers as possible, whilst also trying not to damage ethnic Russian populations too much. And so where are Russians getting the majority of their soldiers? Rural areas, of course. Non-ethnic Russians appear to be targeted for conscription more than ethnic Russians, as Central Asians working in Russia have also been rounded up and sent to join the front. The AC states that a study of the Uzbek community in Russia reports that many Uzbeks have been arrested for minor or contrived offenses and sentenced to elaborate prison terms, often of 15, 20, or even 25 years. Once in prison, they are offered the Wagner option of volunteering to fight in Ukraine. Many likely take the offer, seeing it as the only choice to hopefully survive and return to their lives once the war is over. This is a double-edged sword for the Kremlin, as whilst it doesn't put as many ethnic Russians, Moscow's priority, in harm's way, non-Russian birth rates are higher, especially in more religious communities like Chechnya and Orthodox regions. Utilizing the few people whose birth rates in Russia is actually above the rate of replacement doesn't seem overly sensible in the middle of a demographic crisis. But there is a war on. The soldiers have got to come from somewhere. Moscow clearly recognizes the requirement for balance between the military crisis in Ukraine and the demographic crisis at home. Men with 3 or more children are exempt from being conscripted to fight by Russian law, which will have encouraged couples with 2 children to have a third and somewhat offset that decline. However, given the propensity for the Russian military to target almost anybody for recruitment from the ages of 18 to 70, it's hard to know how much this is actually upheld in practice. The Russians really will take anybody they can get. One way to make up the number of soldiers is with prisoners, as we've seen in the Wagner Group strategy. This recruitment pool has continued to be used after the death of Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin and the integration of Wagner into the Russian armed forces. Ironically, those who had originally made the deal of bullets for freedom served their 6 months in the military and were dutifully released, whilst many non-criminal recruits have been fighting continuously in Ukraine for years now. Many of their contracts not set to end until the war does. We have also seen soldiers' wages in Russia continue to steeply increase as fewer people take the gamble to risk their lives for a financial incentive. The Kremlin is getting desperate. It's not just from more fringe groups inside of Russia where soldiers are conscripted, but outside Russia as well. The AC reports that individuals from Nepal, Syria, and India have been recruited to work in factories or as guards at various venues in Russia. After they arrive, their passports are confiscated and they are sent to fight in Ukraine. What choice do they have so far from home with no passport and no way to defend themselves? In addition to higher wages, prison offers, and straight-up kidnapping people from other countries, another inducement to attract foreign fighters is the offer of Russian citizenship. If these commitments are honored, the result will be to add more non-Russians to the country's population who fought alongside it and therefore, in theory, share similar cultural values. Although we cannot imagine how having a Russian citizenship is in any way advantageous right now, considering it's a one-way ticket to the front. Perhaps desperate enough economic migrants from Central Asia would make the journey in hope of providing a better future for their families once the war is over. However, even this may not be overly enticing, considering that one may well be able to move to Russia post-war with a similar result through employment rather than getting bombed and shot at. The demographic crisis is not going away. Russia will still need the workers post-war. Migrants are not stupid, and many may have seen the writing on the wall when war broke out. According to the Center for Eastern Studies, there are half as many foreign workers in Russia in 2023 as there were in 2021. It does also represent another demographic issue with the war in Ukraine, as able-bodied working men are being made casualties in the thousands every month, so the Kremlin must accept higher levels of immigration in the short term in order to fill those gaps in the economy. But Russia has been on this path for more than a decade. In 2014, when Russia illegally annexed Crimea, it added 2.4 million people to the Russian population, at least by the Kremlin's own figures, but this limited the natural labor pool that already flowed into Russia from Moldova and Ukraine. As a result, after 2014, labor migration in Russia was limited to mostly just 5 Central Asian countries. In 2023, half of Russia's labor migrants came from Tajikistan alone. So why do this? Why in the middle of a demographic crisis did Vladimir Putin choose to start a military conflict with a neighbor which only made said crisis a million times worse? Well, there are a few explanations. The first being that big bad Vlad thought Russia would easily win. Lest we forget the special military operation was only to last 3 days, with the toppling of the Zelensky regime, the capture of Kiev, and the integration of Ukraine into the Russian motherland. If handled successfully, it would have added 38 million more people to the country with barely a shot fired. Putin was led to believe that the Ukrainians would welcome the Russian invaders with open arms as liberators. So, them choosing to take up arms against those forces so effectively definitely proved a shock. This means that whilst invading Ukraine may have been seen from the outset as a demographic crisis solution, the extension of the war has only exacerbated the problem. Putin's rhetoric at the start of the war was that Ukraine was Russian, its citizens were Russian, and therefore it should be a part of Russia. So adding nearly 40 million Russians to the declining population would be an easy way for the Kremlin to go some way to fixing their demographic crisis. But Putin lost that gamble when Ukraine rallied. They were Ukrainian, and they did not want to join Russia. It may also be possible that Putin wasn't totally misled, but saw the writing on the wall. As we've already covered, Putin started talking about Russia's demographic crisis as far back as in 2000, almost a generation ago. Since then, the population has continued to decline, birth rates have decreased, death rates are high, migration is low, and none of Putin's policies implemented were able to stop the rot, only slow it for a while. Putin could have taken one look at the sliding downward trajectory of the Russian population crisis in 2022 and knew that drastic action was required. Putin himself was 70 years old at the time, likely thinking about his legacy in Russia and alongside preconceived delusions of grandeur and a desire to be a hero who returned glory to Mother Russia. Turns out he couldn't seize a chick in Kiev, let alone the real thing. The population crisis was only going to get worse, and Putin was only going to get older. So when 2022 rolled around, it may have been a case of, if not now, then when? The irony, of course, is that Putin's legacy has been damaged by the war. In trying to do something drastic to fix the demographic crisis, he has inadvertently accelerated it. This, of course, has come with huge consequences. The Russian population is an aging one, and there already were not enough young Russian people to take care of the elderly and run Russian society before the war began. The war, the migration of Russians, and the destitution that communities have been left in only stands to ensure two things for the foreseeable future. This problem is not going to go away, and it's not going to get better for the Kremlin. But what are the consequences of Russia's population crisis? We talk about this crisis like it's a big deal. The Kremlin and even Putin himself seem to agree. So what exactly has the Russian state been trying to avoid here? So what does all of this mean for the future of the Russian Federation? Well, the prognosis isn't good. Putin's choice of timing for military aggression in Ukraine might have reflected an understanding that Russia's demographic situation would not improve in the next 2 decades. But indeed, the war is turning a crisis into a catastrophe. Russia's situation is particularly challenging. Between the birth rates, death rates, migration rates, the brain drain, and the war, policy by itself might not be enough to fix it. The Rand Corporation questioned in 1997 how a shrinking working-age population will support a growing number of elderly Russian citizens. It's a generation later, and that's no longer a question, it's a reality, especially with swaths of working-age Russian men being sent to die in Ukraine. The Center for Eastern Studies has stated that the decline in Russia's fertility rate since the war is set to stabilize, and that there is no indication that the war will or has caused a decrease in total Russian fertility numbers. But this isn't just about the war, which, whilst consequential, is dwarfed by decades of failed policy and inaction as the sands of time slowly trickle down the hourglass. Russia's population, like many others in industrialized nations, is set to shrink. The Economist remarked that the Russian population would drop by almost 15 million people by 2050. UN projections for 2100 are even worse, with Russia on the high end predicted to be about 112 million people, on the low end 74 million, which is around half of what it is today in as little as 75 years. That's 3 generations, a dramatic decrease in a very short time. Now, the world population is also said to decrease by 2100 by around 20%, but Russia's decline will be at least 25%, if not 50%. Russia and the future leaders of the Russian Federation have an important choice to make that will impact the future makeup of Russia as we know it. Either policy is changed for the better, public health improves drastically, and the life expectancy of the average Russian joins the rest of the developed world, or there will need to be a way to naturalize non-Russian citizens as Russians en masse. Putin's gambit in Ukraine to do this failed. It cannot be done by force. Russia will have to entice people to it. But that's easier said than done. Wages in Russia are low compared to its counterparts. The economy only stands to shrink further as the population does. Russia would have to offer something that it isn't offering right now to really make a difference. But this will have its own consequences too. Ramping up migration will change the ethnic demography of Russia over time. Just slapping a citizenship test on an Uzbek, a Tajik, or a Kazakh and labeling them a Russian doesn't necessarily make it so. It doesn't erase their cultural heritage, upbringing, or perspective on the world. Russia is running out of Russians. Making more is not easy. What's more is that the demographic groups best matching Putin's August 2022 decree advocating preservation and strengthening traditional Russian spiritual moral values are Russia's non-Russian populations. What Putin is searching for amongst his people already exists, with minority areas of Russia not experiencing the same population issues as ethnic Russian areas are. But to Putin, these minorities are not Russian in the classical sense. He cannot prioritize them over the ethnic Russian population or potentially risk the most important thing of all to him, his regime security. The minorities in Russia have cultures that are distinct. They have languages and traditions that do not match the current Russian status quo. But if Putin wants to bring his population growth rate back into the black, he may have to strike a deal with Central Asian populations and Russian minority groups like the Tatars, Dagestanis, and Chechens. Russia will almost certainly have to be ethnically less Russian and more religiously diverse if the population is to recover. Putin may need to incorporate what is working for them into the rest of Russia, or face a continued population collapse that will be as severe as it would be devastating. For the future, Russia's population will not only be smaller, but also older, more fragile, and less well-educated, making it harder to build sustained growth. It may well spell the end of Russia as one of the heads of the geopolitical table as their capability and economic population shrinks. Many countries will face a decline in their population, but not many will be facing the sheer scope of issues in terms of demography that Russia will. Many more may grow to surpass it in time too. It remains to be seen to what extent Russia will decline, but unless drastic changes are made in the near future, that decline to some extent is almost inevitable, and that could make Vladimir Putin a very dangerous man indeed.